Thank you all. I'm really excited to be hosting this event. Is anyone here in from Burning Man? Maybe that's why we didn't get a full turnout. Still stuck in the mud, but Burning Man is its first principle is radical inclusion. For those of you who might have gone before, and I thought that would be nice to hear from a Burning Man person if they were here, but that kind of appropriate for the topic today, the transition to electrification and mobility and EVs is really the equity issues associated with it are so important, and frankly, I'd say, I was actually talking to Judith earlier, that I work with startups and large companies as well in working on the energy transition and climate related technologies, and I really don't, while electric vehicle infrastructure, all electrification of transportation, charging and all that is such a extremely hot area right now. I really don't see enough companies, really hardly any companies, startups, and that looking at how to really improve equity in the space. So I'm looking forward to learn. I hope that a lot of you will participate in that. But as your host tonight, I should say, Wilson Sonsini, we have about 45 people working in the Energy and Climate Solutions group, of which I'm a part of. And we focus on all things decarbonization and climate change related in terms of startups and large projects and companies, global practice here. We also have a deep connection to Berkeley. I was a Berkeley Law and CLE alum. Many, at least 15 of my colleagues or former colleagues came through the CLE program at Berkeley, so we're huge supporters of the program. So and so with that, I will introduce Matt Gordon from the Clean Tech Action Network, your other co-sponsor with CLE. So Matt.
Thank you, Scott. I'm Matt Gordon. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Executive Director of Climate Tech Action Network. I don't remember how many months ago, last year at some point, Judith and I met at an event at a CLE event at Berkeley, and Climate Tech Action Network's goal is to provide accessible technical education for people about climate tech and climate change. Climate tech is ridiculously complicated. There's like a dozen different verticals in all different areas because we have to transform our entire economy. And I'm going to get a little more central for the camera. It's really difficult to know going into climate tech what impact looks like. And so what we really like to do is bring companies out and have them talk about what they're doing at the bleeding edge of climate that is going to help people. But I talk a lot, I write a lot about equity and about the need for an equitable and just climate transition, and I wanted to work with a group that actually knows something about that. And so I'm really excited. I want to thank CLE, Judith in particular, Louise, who's going to be moderating. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Wilson and C. Goodrich, for hosting us. And thank you all for being here. I just want to mention two other things, if I can read any of my handwriting. But the main thing I want to mention is that our last event of the year is going to be December 13th on a Wednesday. It's going to be at Bear Bottle Brewing in Bernal Heights. And we are having a year-end holiday party, and we are going to be awarding Climate Tech CTO of the Year, probably a very small award, but it's going to be meaningful for probably the hardest working people in the industry and the least appreciated, which is CTO. And I remember when Ken, one of our panelists, and I worked at Kairos Aerospace in methane mitigation, the CTO was absolutely the hardest and least appreciated job. And so I thought to myself, who deserves an award is one of those people. So I'm going to invite you all out to that. If you sign up for our Substack or our newsletter, you'll get some more information about it. And so with that, I would like to hand it over to our moderator, Louise. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. I'm Louise Bedsworth. I'm the Executive Director of CLE. And for folks who don't know CLE, We are a research center within the law school at Berkeley. And what really makes us unique is a couple of things, but one in particular is we're squarely focused on policy implementation and how are we helping to accelerate the scaling and implementation of solutions to our most pressing environmental problems: climate, water, resilience, wildfire, and of course transportation, which we'll be talking about today. So maybe I'll invite our panelists to come up, and then we can sort of, let's see. I don't want to hold this too close because I know that can be problematic sometimes. So, all right, we'll space out. Great. So for tonight, we're focused on the equitable EV transition, and I think this is an example of a lot of the work we're trying to do, which is we have an enormous opportunity right now as we are implementing all of these solutions to really look at how we make this transition differently and how do we do it in a way that brings along all parts of society and all members of our community. So I'll just mention some work we're doing at CLE, which is really focused on equitable EV infrastructure and policy development. And this is an initiative that we got underway over the last year, funded through an award from the Volkswagen settlement. And it's led by Ted Lamb here, one of our senior fellows, and then Ken Alex as well, who is the director of Project Climate at CLE. And what we're doing with this work is really focusing on, through partnerships with cities, how can we support this implementation in an equitable way, and bringing in mapping tools, policy development. We have partnerships with folks with some pro bono support from law firms to look at legal solutions, and then also really doing deep partnership and stakeholder engagement to help look at how we do this work. And so we're very lucky that one of our partners is the city of Oakland. So we'll hear a little bit more about that tonight. But there are just so many dimensions to this challenge and to what we're trying to do. And when we look at, especially in California, where we have a goal to phase out the sale of internal combustion engines over the next, decade or so, we have a lot of work to do. And so that's really what we're trying to do here. And then tonight, we're going to get to hear from a number of different perspectives on how we are tackling this challenge. We're going to start with introductory remarks, a few minutes apiece, or 5 to 7 minutes. I think is kind of what we said. We'll do some questions, but then really want to invite a lot of engagement and questions from you all and discussion here. So we're going to start with hearing from Michael Randolph, who's a transportation planner in the city of Oakland. And he's really doing the work on the ground right now in a city that has an EV action plan with a focus on equity and stakeholder engagement. So we're going to hear from Michael, and then I'll just run through, so we'll hear from Michael, and then we'll get a state perspective from Ken Branson, who is a climate policy advisor to Senator Becker. And he's going to share with us really, how is the state looking at this challenge? We can think about how is the state helping to overcome some of the barriers that we're seeing on the ground, and really what especially the legislature is doing and how we're thinking about meeting the state's goals. And then we'll hear from Adur Balur, who's with the Toyota Research Institute, and get a perspective from a vehicle and manufacturing perspective, and really how you all are approaching this transition as well. And I think this is 3 of the very important perspectives that are going to play a role in how we do this work. But I think we'll also talk about others that we know are part of this solution. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Michael.
Let's push here. Okay. Hey. I'm Michael Randolph, a transportation planner in the Oakland Department of Transportation's Parking and Mobility Division, and I was one of the lead planners for Oakland's Zero Emission Vehicle Action Plan. So basically, we created the Zero Emission Vehicle Action Plan for 3 big reasons. The first reason, the state has very robust targets for clean transportation. I believe 2035, no more sales of gasoline vehicles. And so it was really important that we created a plan to envision that type of future. Second, it was a specific action in a different plan, the Equitable Climate Action Plan. And that's where the city is trying to be carbon neutral by 2040. So another reason why we had to do a very specific plan looking at zero emission vehicles. And then the third reason is that we were very aware that the current status quo of clean transportation and zero emission vehicles and charging is really inequitable in Oakland. As part of the zero emission vehicle plan, we kind of did an existing condition study, and we're really able to see that the individuals that own zero emission vehicles and where the charges were of course in places that tend to be wealthier, Oakland Hills, North Oakland, and the communities that are most affected by not only climate change, air pollution along the I-180 corridor, and like having like the high asthma rates for children and things like that. They're not able to have the benefits of EV or the cleaner air and things like that. So the zero emission vehicle plan is trying to, through outreach process, to identify the barriers to access for EVs and EV charging, and then come up with action-specific things the city can do to address that. And last fall, it was passed by City Council unanimously. It was good, like a year and a half, 2 years of work. And now we're kind of in the implementation phase, trying to basically scrounge together the staff capacity to actually implement all the actions in that plan. I believe there's about 37. And Clea is helping us out, but it's a really, really big undertaking where I'll say like, oh yeah, we can definitely get that passed by December, and I'm like, that's not happening. And so I think it's been an interesting learning process, but also exciting. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Ken Branson. Matt's vision for starting this group was to help people in tech who want to switch and get involved in climate and help solve the biggest challenge of our lifetimes. To do so, and I'm an example of that. I was in enterprise software for many years, then worked a few years with Matt and clean tech, and now I'm working in policy at the state level. So I'm going to give a little bit of a perspective on that, but just thought it would be useful to. There's a way to do it if you want to get involved. So there's kind of 5 ways that the state is pushing this transition in transportation. Actually, let's step back for a second. Transportation is 40% of emissions in California, and another 10% comes from making the fuels that we use in transportation. So it's almost 50% of the problem, right? So that puts it at the top of the priority list to figure out how we're going to make that transition. So the first way that the state's doing this is essentially mandating this switch, right? Mostly through obligations on purchasing. There's a advanced clean cars rule that is the one that requires all sales to be zero emission vehicles by 2035, but it has interim targets. So for example, I think it's 66% by 2030. We're already seeing 25% this last quarter, and I believe in San Mateo County, which is where our district is, it was about 50% last year. So we're making massive progress on sales, switching over. We also have 2 different rules for trucks, which is really important because most of the pollution that is causing asthma is coming from trucks. And so there's one that's advanced clean trucks that requires manufacturers to sell a certain percentage of their vehicles as zero emission vehicles. Going faster for the easier ones, like the small delivery trucks and trucks at ports have to switch over pretty quickly. Longer term for the big semi-trucks and things like that. And then there's, on the flip side of that, there's a mandate for owners of big fleets to purchase and switch their fleets over to zero emission vehicles, so that there's kind of a mandate on the suppliers, but there's also a mandate on the owners to help drive demand, so it helps the manufacturers sell zero emission vehicles. And then there's another one on all the Lyft drivers and Uber drivers. So Lyft and Uber have to reach a target of 90% of the miles driven by 2030 are driven in zero emission vehicles, right? So this is all mandates, regulatory mandates, right? That's step 1. Step 2 is to try and make it easier, cheaper for people to actually follow through on those mandates, right? And so nationally, obviously, we have a lot of money from the IRA for this, but the state also runs a whole bunch of different programs to help subsidize that. And those programs over time have shifted away from being programs for anyone to buy an EV and much more towards, in fact, we stopped funding this old program that was basically a rebate for anyone, and almost all the budget money is going now to something called Clean Cars for All, which is aimed at equity oriented ones, and includes rebates on selling used cars. So if I buy a used EV, I can get a rebate on that under this program for low income. So that's number two, how do we make it cheaper? Number three is we have to have an ability for people to charge. And so again, there's kind of a mandates and money side. On the mandates side, it's mostly building codes, and building codes are forcing whenever you build a new building to have more charging, both at commercial, so that you can, workplace charging, and also a big push on multifamily, which I think is the biggest problem. No one's going to buy an EV if they don't have a place they can charge it. And at my house, I can install a charger myself. But if I live in an apartment, I don't have that choice. And so, the biggest deterrent when we start thinking about how do we get to 50 and 70% of sales being EVs, is to make sure that people who live in multifamily housing where they don't own the building, they'll still have access to charging. And then we have, so that's the mandate side of it. And then again, on the money side, there's a huge amount of money, both federally from the IIJA and then in the state budget, to fund charging. And most of that money is going towards either charging along major highway corridors or trying to fill in the gaps where the private market hasn't already decided to build charging. So they're looking at these maps of, where do we have low density of charging, and that's where the money is being funneled. And then number 5 is, if we're gonna have that much charging, we had better have the grid upgraded to be able to handle that, right? And actually one of the biggest deterrents to building out more charging is the fact that the distribution grid can't handle it. There's billions of dollars in ratepayer money and the utilities being spent on what they call make-ready infrastructure, so that the infrastructure is there, so that the charging company can come install their chargers. But we're also, looking at all the things like how do we just generate enough clean energy on the grid to handle the fact that we're going to double our energy consumption as we decarbonize the economy. So from the state level, that's kind of how we're looking at this whole transition and what's going on.
Great, thanks. My name is Madhur. I work at Toyota Research Institute, and this will be a much less structured introduction than Ken's was. So I'm really happy to be here. So I work at Toyota, and what my role is I manage decarbonization strategy for Toyota Research Institute. What that means is that I do a lot of need finding across Toyota to understand where are the information and knowledge gaps in order to make good decarbonization decisions, right? So that takes me across a variety of different topics and disciplines, whether it's hydrogen, EV charging infrastructure, battery supply chains, whether it's looking at the policy side or the technology or investment side. So really broad, and I think seeing a room full of folks that have backgrounds in technology or policy, getting a chance to all talk together is awesome. We need more of this kind of multidisciplinary conversation. So thanks to all the organizers for putting this together and convening this room here. So, working at Toyota, it's very clear that the private sector has an important role in this topic, but it's also important that our first role is really going to be to listen and learn, right? So I'm excited to be here to learn from my fellow panelists, moderators, all of you in the audience about what is needed in order to ensure a more equitable transition to a decarbonized future. For Toyota, broadly as a company, we sell a lot of cars around the world, and my main goal here is to successfully achieve rapid, equitable decarbonization, right? So that requires pragmatic solutions, it requires affordable, accessible solutions. And Toyota's approach for this has been providing a clean solution no matter what type of vehicle you want to operate and kind of where you live, right? So for the commercial sector, like we talked about, there's been a lot of work that Toyota's done in the Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, to build fuel cell heavy-duty trucks to make sure that we're not only reducing CO2, but we're also reducing criteria pollutants, particulates, and other things that are causing acute health hazards in the community. And this is a solution that Toyota believes in because we recognize that for applications that require kind of lots of cargo to be carried back and forth or require high utilization and uptime, you need solutions that are going to be able to provide that without much sacrifice. Fuel cell systems, a lot lighter than battery systems, and can be fueled much faster. Now, in the passenger vehicle space, Toyota is committed to EVs as a key piece within the portfolio. Right? So there are plans globally to sell 3.5 million battery electric vehicles per year by 2030. It's a lot. And there's a lot of new models coming because, again, optionality is key. Right? We need low-cost models across different vehicle types. whether it's folks that are driving pickup trucks or SUVs or cars, depending on what the customer's needs are, we need to provide them with a good, clean solution for them, right? And for folks that live in multifamily housing, for example, there's a variety of different tools that we could provide to meet their needs. It could be long-range battery electric vehicles that allows them to drive long distances without having to charge often. And right now, we see a lot of promise for solutions like plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, especially those that have a long enough electric range, right? So most Americans drive around 30 to 40 miles a day. So if you have a plug-in hybrid that has a range that's above that, you can actually get all of your driving miles on electricity, cleaner, ideally cheaper, and if and when you need to go a little further, you have that option as well, right? But there's a lot of great work that still needs to be done. And on the equity side, we need to bring the prices of vehicles down. We also need to make sure that there's sufficient charging infrastructure out there, and not just sufficient, but affordable charging infrastructure, right? So relying on public fast charging may be convenient, but right now the price of public fast charging is much higher than the cost of home charging or even public slow AC charging. So how do we provide solutions that can meet people where they are at price points that they can pay, right, without having to sacrifice convenience and quality of life? So, some of the many things we're thinking about. Happy to go into more detail soon. So thanks.
Great. Well, thank you all. That was really great to hear all your different perspectives. One thing I was wondering if we could touch on, which we talked about a little bit when we spoke before this, was the concept of how EVs fit into the thinking about the future of mobility. And I know you mentioned this, Michael, in the context of the planning in Oakland, that EVs are a piece of what you all, and I'm wondering, and then I would love to hear, I know, Madhur, you mentioned that also with Toyota, sort of thinking about it as a mobility company, and then, obviously the state's approach, Ken, is looking at a lot of different things. So how EVs fit into this larger future of mobility. Maybe Michael, start with you.
Yeah, I think kind of following the state and how they kind of define zero emission vehicle, that's kind of what we followed with our roadmap. It's called the zero emission vehicle plan, not just electric vehicle roadmap. So we wanted to be kind of technology neutral in that way, to leave it open to how fast things change. But also, there are actions in the plan also focusing on e-micromobility, scooters and e-bikes, and looking at actions that would increase those, looking at the possibility for like e-cargo bikes for delivery and business and things like that. And in general, I think that we have this like pretty front-loaded in the plan, kind of explaining what the city's transportation priorities are, and that it's kind of like a mobility pyramid, in that we want to make sure that we're helping people to walk, bike, use public transit, and then we look at like car sharing and things like that, and then after that we're looking, okay, then for those that can't that need to use a car, we would like that car to be a zero emission vehicle. And so there's a lot of competing uses, especially at the curb, if we're going to think about chargers in the public right of way. And so we wanted to be very clear about like where EVs like stand in the hierarchy of like what our transportation priorities are. We're not going to degrade the pedestrian, bike lanes, and public transit to favor a single occupancy EV. And so that was very important for us, just thinking about where EVs fit in our strategies as a city when it comes to transportation.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different solutions that can meet people's needs, right? So for Toyota, like I said, there's a lot of work being done on passenger vehicles to look at different powertrains that can meet folks' needs. But more broadly, thinking of us as a mobility company, there's work being done to look at different methods of transportation as well, right? So there's work being done in different markets, specifically Japan, in Europe, looking at cleaner options for buses, for example. So we know that there's a pretty hefty price tag for a lot of vehicles. The price of a new vehicle in the US has more than inched upwards, right? It's really kind of leapt up to, I think, what, $45,000 per car last year, right, around the country. So it's very expensive to buy a new car. And we recognize that we need clean solutions for everyone, including those that aren't able to afford these passenger vehicles at this point. So having cleaner options for buses that have high utilization in cities, drive around a lot, emit a lot of not only CO2, but again, particulates and criteria pollutants is very important. One example is we have some partnerships in Europe where Toyota is providing fuel cell systems for bus manufacturers. So you have, again, zero emission buses that can drive around in different city centers as well. In the ride-sharing space, there's been collaborations and partnerships with taxi companies in Europe as well to provide the Mirai, the fuel cell Toyota, to taxi operators to give them the ability to drive 400 miles without having to stop and fuel, again, with a zero-emission vehicle, right? And this has been quite successful in places in those markets, and there's certainly the possibility of expanding that here to the US as well.
So part of the state's climate plan involves reducing what's called vehicle miles traveled. So how many miles per person do we all drive every year? And so, the strategies here are around zoning and housing, more transit-oriented development, more buses, all these things. I think all that's good, but the sad reality is we've been very unsuccessful at reducing those numbers. And the people at Rewiring America would say, like, yeah, that's really great, but at the same time, the easiest thing to do without depending on social change is to just replace the thing that you're using today that is using gasoline with something that's equivalent to you that doesn't use gasoline or doesn't use fossil fuels. So I think we should definitely do those other things, but I worry about overly relying on those things because they require behavior change, which it's very hard to do. And hence, I think it's extremely important that we can let people have a drop-in replacement vehicle that's a lot cleaner.
Great. One other thing I wanted to touch on is just the different dimensions of equity. And so when you all are approaching and thinking about an equitable EV transition, who are you thinking about when you're sort of approaching the problem that way? And so, yeah, and I know the state is looking at lots of folks. Yeah, so how's that working?
Yeah, so actually, when we were going to do this event, I sort of organized my thinking around that a little bit. We think about, let's say, 4 different groups. So the first one, and probably the most important and common one that we're thinking about, is the low-income person who lives in multifamily housing, right? If the state is going to be successful, that person needs to be able to afford an EV, they need a place to charge that EV, they can't have range anxiety about it, right? It has to be inexpensive. So how do we help that person? Another person is the rural drivers, right? It's easier to envision this with the people who are driving 30 or 40 miles a day than the person who's commuting in from Modesto into the Bay Area to work, right? Those super users are actually consuming a lot more gasoline than almost anyone else, but it's actually also harder to solve the problem for them than almost anyone else. But because EVs are cheaper to drive, it would also save them a lot more money than anyone else if they can do that. So we have to think about solutions that are going to work for that class of people. It turns out there are a lot of independent truck drivers who own their own vehicles, and as we force this transition in medium and heavy duty trucks, we need those people who are not well off, right, to be able to switch to a new truck, which may cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we need to think about an equitable and feasible approach for those people. And then there are a set of people who are not necessarily drivers at all, right? It's the people who live in Oakland near the freeways and ports who are suffering with really bad air quality. And those people stand to gain a huge amount in terms of equity by making this transition happen. In fact, when LA looked at their plan for getting to 100% clean energy, they called this LA 100 plan, and they looked at the costs and benefits of it. By far, the biggest benefits came from all the health benefits from getting rid of mostly emissions from transportation. You know, we talk about shutting down the gas plants because the gas plants are dirty, but actually most of the benefit comes from decarbonizing transportation.
Yeah, and I guess at the city local level, we're looking at like the specific communities in Oakland that have been underserved for so long. the Oakland Department of Transportation has an equity toolkit, which kind of organizes different census tracts, census blocks, and communities in Oakland that we want to focus on. I think we knew starting the plan that there was, like I said earlier, really a disparity in where zero emission vehicles were, where the charging was, and who had access to that. And we really wanted to make sure we were identifying what the barriers were and what actions we could take to break down those barriers. We made sure that like our outreach was happening in those communities. We did workshops in West Oakland, Fruitvale, East Oakland, and I think the local cities like Oakland have limited staff capacity, have limited resources, and I think there will be communities that where private investment will go in and invest in EV charging, and I think we're just trying to focus our intention on those communities where it's going to be a lot harder, where there has to be more work done, more pairing EV chargers with other amenities, more education about and awareness about how electric vehicles work. I think something we learned is that we were starting off from a very, very low point on just like an education piece on what an electric vehicle was. People were worried about like radiation and things like that. And so there just me realizing going through the process of developing the plan, that education and awareness is just going to be such a huge important factor to actually make the transition.
Great. So one other thing we've talked about is the role the state has played and the federal government has played in putting a lot of money into helping people purchase EVs. What needs to accompany that so that we can actually see an incentive program be successful?
Yeah, I'll speak on this. I think that, like I said, this is kind of building on what I said earlier about how important education and awareness is, especially because of kind of how difficult it might be to understand how the incentive program works, how to be a part of it, understanding if you qualify or not. If English isn't your first language, then it's really incredibly difficult. We were working with a great organization, Spanish Speaking Citizens Foundation, in Fruitvale to do outreach and engagement for the plan. And I think there was just kind of like this need for like more Spanish language in particular. Education and outreach on how to be a part of the incentives. There kind of was like a hunger that was like a little bit activated with some of the workshops we did. So yeah, I think that's just kind of been like the biggest thing. There just needs to be those resources to connect people to the incentives, because just kind of putting the incentives out there needs to be a connection somehow.
I think more than, well, I'm sure price is a really important point, but I think more than that is just this question of where am I going to charge my car? And if I only charge my car at fast chargers, like Medgar said, it's very expensive. And so one of the things that just went into the last round of the building codes is that when you install the chargers at multifamily apartments, when possible, you need to wire it so that it's actually connected to their home meter and not to sort of a charge point kind of third party, so that you're actually paying for it the same way you'd pay out of your home, which is way, way less expensive. And if it's not wired that way, it'll end up costing twice as much for the electricity to charge the car. So it's like little things like that are really important to make both access to charging, but then access to charging as affordably as possible, really important. And then I think the second thing, which people don't really talk about, but how often do low-income people buy new cars? I think that's not typically the way that works. So a part of what needs to happen is, as we get more cars out into the marketplace, and then we start having 3-year-old and 5-year-old cars, as long as the batteries are good enough, which I think is an important issue for our manufacturers over here, like that's when you're going to start seeing cars going into lower income neighborhoods, when they start becoming affordable as secondhand cars, as long as the infrastructure is also there to make that a good, affordable choice for people. So the fact that we're getting a lot more cars out of the market, I think that's a really important step to then having affordable cars. Certainly I didn't buy a new car for many, many years until I was in my 40s and much better off. So I just feel like that's an underappreciated aspect of how do we get cars into more people's hands. Well, we have to have a bunch of used cars out there that are going to be more affordable.
Yeah, I think the charging access at home is definitely a good point, and I think there's work to be done on smart charging, right? Being able to tune when the actual charging happens automatically in a way that actually is both beneficial for the environment and for the wallet, right? This idea that if you can charge your vehicle when there's either excess renewables during the day or when there's just low demand in the middle of the night, that's good for the climate, and it's also cheaper, right, ideally, for the customer as well. And that has significant equity implications there. So there's work being done, certainly by charging companies, to have smart chargers. The approach of connecting it, I think, directly to the meter may preclude some of those, but that may be okay because a lot of automakers, including Toyota, have these telematics capabilities on the car. So you can actually tune when your car is charging automatically through a mobile app with little to zero effort at all, right? So I think that's an important solution that can be helpful as well in this picture.
Well, I want to give an opportunity if folks in the audience, I have more questions I can ask, but I want to open it up if folks here have questions.
Yeah, I have a question particularly to Oakland and the state with regards to like NOx and pollution and solving the asthma problem versus when also thinking about small operators with small fleets. You mentioned, individual operators have their own trucks, and they don't want to go out and buy new trucks. But then do they have to wait that 3 to 5 years before they can get a used EV, or is there incentives also for repowering those particular trucks with an electric axle?
I have seen some effort going into repowering existing vehicles with electric drivetrains, but pretty much only aimed at kind of classic cars, where people really want to hang on to that classic car, but they want to decarbonize it. It turns out I don't think it's economical to do that. So all of the effort has been, as new cars come into the market, they come into them, as EVs, and we're going to do a kind of replace on burnout approach. There are some really interesting business models where it's like a lease model, so you don't have to have the upfront cash to buy a really expensive EV. It's actually cheaper to operate an EV truck than it is a regular truck, and so over the lifetime of the vehicle, the total cost of ownership can be lower, which means that the monthly cost to you can be lower by leasing it and using electricity rather than diesel and buying and financing a new truck. And if you do it that way, you can then pair that with a charging depot. So you'll see companies out there that are essentially going to set up a charging depot, purchase a bunch of trucks, rent them out to people, right? And the person has a place to park it at night and charge it, and they have a vehicle to drive during the day for their job, and then they bring it back. And so this is a way of making it, taking away that huge upfront cost of having to buy one, and still allowing these kind of owner-operators to be independent truck drivers with access to a truck, and it solves their charging problem as well. So I think interesting things like that we're seeing people are introducing.
And sorry, Michael, did you want to say anything else? So as a city that is home to a major port, some of the challenges that the city has in what you're able to do and not able to do with regards to heavy-duty trucks?
Yeah, so in the plan we do look at medium and heavy-duty fleets and what we can do as a city. I think over the course of the development of the plan, we kind of realized that we were kind of limited as a city in what we could do. I think it is like a very regional thing, thinking about where trucks are coming in from, and it's definitely something that like the port plays a really big role in. I think during the process, though, our clean energy aggregator, East Bay Community Energy, kind of really stood up as kind of being someone that regionally is looking at an area of East Bay that includes Oakland, as far as kind of coming up with a strategy and identifying ways to do that transition for medium and heavy duty fleets. And I think that the role, at least for as a locality, is to be a stakeholder, help convene the different folks together, and then also kind of identify places that might be good places for truck charging hubs and things like that. And that's kind of where we fell in understanding what our role is specifically for medium and heavy duty fleets. I think it would be very difficult for us as a city with the capacity we have to be a leader. And that's why I'm really happy that East Bay Community Energy has decided to be a leader, at least for medium heavy duty fleets and trying to understand how to put together a regional strategy.
Last year, I talked to some scientists from Lawrence National Lab, and they told me that the battery from an EV is actually very toxic and can start to pollute the environment, the water, the sea, and everything that lives in the water or drinks the water after the battery is disposed, and that battery is not recyclable. So my question is, has any business or government done any analysis to actually quantify the good sides and bad sides of the battery and make sure the net effect is positive? Because I don't want to feel good, but actually do something bad for the environment. And the second question is for Toyota. Actually have bought 2 Toyota cars, so I really like the brand. What's the usual period from the R&D stage to the actual release to customers? Because I don't want to be just an experiment for any car companies. That's why I don't plan to buy a Tesla in the near future. So I want to make sure that any EV that you release in the future will be tested for many, many years. Thank you.
Madhur, I don't know, you might be best suited to speak to both of those questions.
I can definitely give it a shot to start. So thanks for the questions, really thought provoking and important. So for the first one, would love to see if you could either send me or let me know who from Lawrence, or I can look up from Lawrence Berkeley who's done the report, but would love to understand that a bit more. I think in general, recycling of batteries is very important, right? For the toxicity and for the critical material supply chain aspect, and from a cost standpoint and a CO2 standpoint, for many reasons, battery recycling is very, very important. We're seeing a lot of regions requiring better tracking of where materials come from and where they end up at the end of life. I think one point that relates somewhat to what Ken had mentioned earlier, automakers, including Toyota, are putting a lot of work into making sure batteries last much longer. So that's kind of the first step, which means that end of life comes further and further away, right? So there's opportunity for second use as well, even after the vehicle, but inevitably batteries eventually will reach end of life. And at that point, recycling is very important. Toyota has been partnering with multiple different companies, including Redwood Materials, to set up for battery recycling for our batteries specifically, right? So that's one point there. Regarding the question of how long it takes to go from R&D to market, a long time, right? So research to go from a lab, for example, to market can take a very long time, and then to scale even longer, right? So we've seen for solar, for wind, for batteries, it's taken decades to really get to scale in the market. That being said, folks have been working on these technologies for decades, right? So I have a lot of confidence in where the battery and EV market has progressed in recent years. In general, when most OEMs plan a car, it takes about 4 or 5 years for that planning cycle to go into effect. But regardless, especially for a company like Toyota, reliability is absolutely essential, right? And when we think about the cost for consumers, if you put out a car that is unreliable, that will be the most expensive option for them, right? Even if it's affordable to buy, if it fails after a couple of years, it's going to be the most expensive option, right? So reliability is essential, and there's immense work being done to make sure that the technology is robust before it gets out there into the field.
I was just going to comment on the recycling aspect. So this has gotten a lot of attention, particularly because we get a lot of our critical minerals from other countries that we don't necessarily like our reliance on them. So I think Redwood Materials was one of the recipients of a really big Department of Energy Loan Program Office loan to build out a huge recycling facility. So that's already getting started. Everyone knows an avalanche of batteries is coming. And there's pretty good technology now to start recycling that stuff.
Hi, my name is is Hannah, and I moved to San Francisco a few years ago, and I moved to Bernal Heights, and there's one hydrogen refueling station less than a mile from where I lived, and I thought, okay, I guess one's literally in my backyard, they must be everywhere, and that is definitely not the case. So I work on policy, and I was kind of developing a recap of what we're seeing in the legislature this year in California. And hydrogen, got its own slide as I was doing this presentation. I would love to kind of hear from City, Toyota, State's perspective on hydrogen and specifically on the refueling aspect of hydrogen, because I think a lot of air gets taken up by talking about the vehicles, whether that's fleet or light duty. Not as much on the refueling to support the anticipated kind of adoption of hydrogen.
So the state has had a long-standing policy of supporting zero-emission vehicles, and supposedly that should be tech neutral. It's also had a long-standing goal of having 100 hydrogen fueling stations around the state, which is seen as kind of enough to be kind of minimum to make people comfortable to get this. I don't know what the current number is, but I think it's only around half that, or like 50. And there's always a big fight over how much funding goes towards EVs versus hydrogen fueling stations. I would say that there's a majority of the people in the legislature are skeptical of hydrogen for a variety of uses. So you'll hear hydrogen for home heating. It's a terrible idea. Blending hydrogen into the gas pipeline is a really stupid idea. Hydrogen for light-duty vehicles, maybe, right? As he was saying, that if you can have a hybrid that is mostly battery electric and occasionally you need to go farther, or you don't have any access to charging, and so what are you going to do, right? Like, there are use cases where maybe hydrogen is the right choice, even though in the long run you should expect the cost of hydrogen to be much higher per unit of energy than it will be for electricity. Maybe there are people who would pay for that because they need it. For long distance trucking, yeah, maybe so, right? For buses that have to run for hundreds of miles a day, maybe so. For trains. So I think that there are probably some transportation use cases, but I think there's a lot of skepticism that we should be spending state and public money for light duty oriented fueling stations. And that's why we still don't have that many, and I think that may continue to be the case.
Yeah, and following the lead of the state, we call it, like I said, zero emission vehicle plan, to like kind of leave open the idea that we could be looking at hydrogen if technology changes for whatever reason. But I think as far as like what our cities, like our current experience, as far as like, okay, taking all equal, what can the city do to push forward? Like, we have experience putting forward EV chargers. We can plan for that, like, and get chargers out there. For hydrogen fueling, a little bit more complicated and less likely. But of course, I think open to trying to figure out how to have more hydrogen fueling stations, especially for the medium and heavy duty use case, and working together with East Bay Community Energy. I believe there is something in the works around the Port of Oakland, West Oakland maybe, I'm not sure though.
Thanks. Yeah, not a whole lot to add to what's been said. Definitely agree with all of that. So yeah, right now they're definitely not everywhere, the fueling stations, right? There's like, I think on the order of 62, 63 stations in California, and the stations are only in California, right, in the US. There's maybe a couple small private stations elsewhere, but it's negligible. So yeah, it has been a slower rollout of infrastructure than many expected. I think at some point the state's goal may have even been 200, if I'm not mistaken. So there was a lot of ambition. It's been a little bit slow to get all that up and running for many understandable reasons. There's a lot more excitement, kind of alluding to Ken's point around heavy duty, long haul trucking, other applications. The government investment from the federal side on hydrogen hubs will be interesting to keep track of and see how that changes things, if at all. We've seen way more applications than I think even the government expected from regions all around the country to get their chunk of the billions that are being allocated to this. The general idea is co-locating demand and supply within a certain region. And that's critical, right? Because if you build a lot of infrastructure and no one's there to use it, you've sunk a lot of cost and you're not going to be able to recoup that. If you sell a lot of vehicles and you don't have the infrastructure, you're going to have a lot of unhappy customers. So you need to simultaneously co-develop supply and demand which is what the hubs are hoping to do. So definitely keen to stay tuned and see how that develops.
I've got a follow-on question to the hydrogen fueling piece, which is the last time I looked at hydrogen in terms of an efficiency, it was like when I went and I went to the Bernal Heights fueling center and I went and kind of backtracked, like where does the hydrogen come from? It comes from, you know, natural gas cracking, and it would have been more efficient to fuel the vehicle with natural gas in terms of CO2 emissions. The last thing that I looked at is that it would be more efficient from a CO2 emission standpoint to fuel the vehicle with natural gas than with hydrogen. So where does Toyota and the state stand on pushing the hydrogen currently has this shine of it's awesome for the environment, and it could be, and it's great for the heavy duty applications, but at the moment nobody kind of gets this underbelly of hydrogen currently largely comes from cracking natural gas, and that releases a lot of CO2, which makes things worse. So that's kind of for the state.
Yeah, so a couple things about that. So first of all, the hydrogen sold in fueling stations like that has a minimum renewable standard to it.
Okay.
So it's not all coming from cracking natural gas. In fact, probably most of it is not. Most of it's probably coming from cracking biogas from, you know, dairy methane digesters and things like that. But a bigger picture question is kind of a philosophical question, right? We're all or many of us are driving EVs. Those EVs are charging from the grid. The grid is not 100% clean. And in fact, if you plug in your EV in the middle of the night, you're effectively charging your EV off of a natural gas peaker plant, right? So those EVs are not necessarily, in the short run, reducing emissions. But the whole strategy of getting to a clean energy economy is that we need to change the machines into machines that use a source of energy that can be clean, and then simultaneously clean up that source of energy, right? So if we can get people to switch to EVs, even though the grid isn't entirely clean, and in parallel, we can switch the electricity to being renewable, then we will solve the problem. But if we have people driving gas vehicles, I can't do anything to clean the gas, right? And so so you're gonna see that all the time, right? It's still better to switch to an EV because we are in parallel cleaning up your electricity, and we need that to happen. And you can make a similar argument. Even if the hydrogen isn't 100% clean, switching to a hydrogen vehicle where the hydrogen in parallel is also getting clean would still be a beneficial part of the strategy.
And just to quickly add to that, so I would say that governments have also recognized the need for this and the need to accelerate this transition to clean hydrogen, right? So both in many regions, for example, in the US, we have a new hydrogen production tax credit, which provides up to $3 per kilogram of incentive if the hydrogen is clean, right? And they set their threshold for how clean is clean enough. And then generally speaking, it requires electrolysis, so kind of clean electricity to power a system that splits water to make hydrogen and oxygen and that doesn't have any emissions associated with it, right? So that's kind of the gold standard that folks are moving towards, and policy incentivizes that transition. Europe has seen a similar transition with a slightly different threshold, but generally speaking, I think that's the direction that most folks are pushing in, which I think will be helpful.
I have an entirely self-serving question for Michael.
Sorry, Michael.
So Michael, if in your role, if there was one thing that you could ask of your state legislature to deliver to cities, what would that be?
Like money for more staffing.
Other than money.
It's always money.
Yeah. Okay. I think of course, just staff capacity is always a really big issue to just focus time to solve these issues. But I think beyond that, I think probably I did discuss kind of the education and awareness piece to connect to incentives, but then also maybe even just the technical feasibility for locations, just to try to kind of help smooth the process from the idea to permit to installation. because there's like a bunch of things can go wrong when you put in like EV charging. Like I think when I first started, they found an underground storage tank, and that's like delayed it by almost like a year. And then some other things this state can do. So it always comes to resources. But then I think additionally, so there's technical feasibility, and probably need to think about it a little more. Because I think because like capacity is always my go-to answer. But then yeah, but I think that the technical feasibility, I think, piece of it is definitely important. Yeah.
How often do you run into? How often do you run into the fact that you need the utility to do something so that you actually can get that much power to that spot?
Oh yeah, that's the thing. It's the I think that the utilities, PG&E in our case, they usually are a big barrier to getting infrastructure in, whether it's just them being slower or the infrastructure not being good enough that it will require more resources to upgrade. I think this is particularly important if we're talking about getting infrastructure in underserved communities where the infrastructure is going to tend to be older and less able to handle the high amount of electricity that's needed to charge if we're talking DC fast chargers. I know, for example, because of the particularities of how utilities work in the Bay Area, it's something that we've come up against, I think. Los Angeles and Seattle, for instance, are able to really explore the ideas of streetlight charging. And for whatever reason, we can't really due to some of the rate issues related to our utility. It might be something that'll be solved in the future, but it kind of is a little bit out of the hands of local governments because unlike Los Angeles, unlike Seattle, we aren't a utility, and so we're not able to kind of make the decisions to probably have the flexibility to do some of those ideas like streetlight charging that could, for example, really open up a lot of charging on the street. It's just our biggest barrier is just we aren't the utility and we can't make those decisions, and they have very different incentives than we do. Now that said, I think East Bay Community Energy, kind of where city councilors are on the board, the city of Oakland is on the board. It's much more of like a public-public partnership, and they're really a partner in trying to get more chargers out there. We do have slightly different incentives. They're thinking slightly differently than we are as far as what we want to do, but for the most part, they've been a really great partner.
Is there one advancement in EVs that, from a local and state level, you feel like would speed up progress toward your policy goals the quickest? And then I guess for Toyota, is there one advancement in zero emission vehicles that you feel like could get them in the hands of more people?
I'm thinking like if the chargers were like smaller and less complicated, I think as far as thinking about like public right-of-way charging and the issues we've had with them, it's very complicated. And if it was simpler or didn't require as much energy, it might solve some issues. I think for at least thinking specifically about DC fast charging, level 3 charging, I think we found that there are, at least in the city of Oakland, we've kind of gotten a lot of the low-hanging fruit. I think a lot of companies really want like diagonal spaces and for parking, and there aren't that many of them. I think there are a few more that we can go for, but for the most part, it's difficult to think about. Like doing it parallel is very difficult, and like a lot of at least private companies aren't really interested in looking at DC fast charging for parallel parking, particularly because like maybe the chargers on different sides of the cars and things like that, and then also just the size of the chargers. The curb space is very limited. There's a lot of different activities that are happening at the curb space, And we really are also thinking about accessibility, and we don't want to like take away space and making a sidewalk more narrow. We want to have chargers that are able to be used by folks in wheelchairs and things like that, and you need space to do that. So I think that those are just, at least with implementing chargers in the public right of way, which I've been thinking about like a lot lately, that those are kind of like the big things that have come to mind.
There is unfortunately no silver bullet for a single kind of change technology-wise that's going to open it up to the masses, unfortunately. It's going to be a multi-pronged approach where you improve the energy density of the battery, which would allow you to either get more range, right, in the same kind of footprint of the car, which allows folks that are commuting longer distances, for example, to be able to own and operate an EV. That's one possibility. Higher energy density maybe also allows you to get away with like it's kind of smaller battery and cheaper materials, more affordable car. That's a possibility. You want the vehicle, the battery, to be able to handle higher speed charging. So we talked about the challenges when it comes to the price of fast charging, but also earlier we mentioned, making sure the battery can last a long time is important. And I think broadly, if you look at historic data for many companies, the ones that fast charge really often have worse battery life after a certain number of years, right? So making sure the vehicles can last longer while fast charging is also going to be really important. So a number of different things that have to be done on the technology side that are all being worked on, but lots to do.
We were just talking about feedstock and costs for fuel inputs, and we were just talking about the utility sort of being the wrench in the works a lot of the time. And so I'm curious to hear from, I'm going to validate Toyota's slow planning EV strategy here. So I run an EV leasing business, and I'm an Oakland resident. I pay for power too, so I'm very aware of all this stuff. I pay 30 cents a kilowatt hour. I get 3 miles per kilowatt hour in my car. That's 10 cents a mile, if you do the math. If I go buy a Toyota Prius hybrid, not even plug-in hybrid, gas is $5 a gallon, that's 10 cents a mile. If you look at historic electricity rates, they're going up much faster than are the price of gas. We don't have a discussion around where energy prices are going. So how can the state justify 100% mandate if the economic benefit is actually being eroded by the utilities, be it the IOUs or the CCAs? So an EBCE customer is very expensive, even though it's cheaper than BG&E. So how does the state view this issue? How can the local municipality, what can you do with EBCE to say, hey, look, we want you to go electric. We're going to use our buying power to get you below market rates. Renewables are effectively free. I see very little of that benefit on my energy bill. I guess there's nothing for Toyota, so keep up the good work.
A bunch of stuff in there. I mean, if you're on an EV rate, you can get about 18 cents per kilowatt hour. And at least for my car, I get about 4 miles per kilowatt hour. So it's like 4.5 cents a mile. So at least for me, my math is looks a little better.
It's different depending on utility territory.
Yeah. I guess I'll flip the question around to you. Should we not solve the climate crisis if it costs more? Right? I mean, I think there's an attitude of like, look, we got to do this. We got to do it as cheaply as we can, but even if it is going to cost a little more, we still have to do it. So there's a bit of that in there. The state is very concerned about electricity rates. A lot of the increase in electricity rates is actually being driven by things like wildfire mitigation costs and stuff that's not really directly related to the cost of providing the electricity. Also, if you think about your bill, the amount that you're paying for, the cost to the utility of getting the power is between 4 and 8 cents a kilowatt, right? Per kilowatt hour. A lot of the rest of the cost is just lumping in all these fixed costs into those rates. And there's an active proceeding to say, well, actually, we're going to change that. We're going to change it, so we're going to shift the way we pay for electricity. You'll pay a little bit more as a fixed charge every month, which will then get the per kilowatt hour charge, per amount of electricity you buy to be lower, which will be beneficial for people who are electrifying, because now, as long as I'm paying the fixed charge anyway, which is sort of representative of my share of the cost of all the fixed costs of the grid, then using more electricity will look cheap, right? If I get an EV, then maybe I'm only paying 12 cents a kilowatt hour, right? And that's going to look a lot cheaper. So we're doing a number of things like that to try to make the economics of this better.
Is that the one that's tiered by income?
Yes, it's going to be a little controversial. Actually, I heard the proposal there is that it's going to be more like we do electricity rates right now, where it's kind of a price that everyone pays, but for low-income customers who qualify under the CARE and FARA programs, that they will receive a discounted numbers, right? But there's not going to be income tiers up above that, where wealthy people are paying huge prices because that was never going to fly. Mostly because of the is big tax. Franchise tax board and share all of our tax returns with PG&E? Probably not.
So I know we're getting close to the end on time. I think I saw another hand over here. Yeah, go ahead.
So just kind of interested from this equity perspective in terms of policy making. So can you either point to some tools that have been effective either in the EV space, or if there aren't any you can point to maybe kind of in a similar type of equity inclusion space that have been effective in rolling out new technologies in a way that it's going to not just the highest tiers of people, but the broadest number of people, and what has worked well for both the state and localities. And I guess a quick follow-on to that is if there's any low-hanging fruit you see with this. I know you noted a few in Oakland already. So.
Yeah, I think that the thing is we're trying to do this now, so it's almost too soon to see what's worked really well. I think we're trying to track if we do the actions in our plan, we want to see are there chargers in underserved neighborhoods? Has there been an uptake in zero emission vehicles in these neighborhoods? And we kind of just have to see as far as thinking about other clean technologies. I think we have a e-bike lending program that we got funding for that we're trying to figure out how to bring to Oakland communities. And then I know the city of Berkeley has had an e-bike giveaway program that I hear has been pretty successful. But I think part of it is that this is it's new technology, and I guess we don't really know the best way to get this out there, and we're just kind of trying new things, trying new pilots, and learning and doing this a lot of learning of just what works, what doesn't work. I think something I've realized, particularly with working with EV chargers and things, is that it's new technology, and even just staff is trying to understand, the engineers and people working the permits are trying to understand what's different, what does it actually mean, and that slows us down because it's just something that they're not used to. And so we're still trying to figure it out.
I think it's a good question. I think new technology is often expensive, and new technology is often not adopted in an equitable way, right? And I think that's an example. EVs are a great example of that, but I think rooftop solar is a good analogy, right? I mean, rooftop solar was hugely expensive. Only wealthy people put it on their rooftops, and not because it was saving them money, but because it was cool and they could talk to their friends about it. Eventually it got cheap, and then the question was, well, once it got cheap and it actually was beneficial, right? How do we make sure that the potential to benefit from it was also available to lower income people who maybe don't have the credit score to go out and get the loan to get the rooftop solar, or they live in an apartment and they can't just put it on their own roof. And so then you look at programs that the state has done to both subsidize and kind of set up programs that allow kind of community solar kinds of things. The state of California has done a terrible job creating community solar, but there's an effort right now to make that more possible, and then to make sure that that's at least 51% of it is available to low and moderate income folks. And so there are things you can do. It's typically not the first movers who are going to be low income people, but once it is clearly of benefit, then we got to figure out how to make it more accessible so that those benefits are more widely shared.
Thank you. Well, I know I can smell that we have some snacks that have arrived, and so want to make sure everyone has time to enjoy those and enjoy each other's company. I might ask each of our panelists one final question, which is, as we all live in communities, we've heard a lot of people's perspective on things that they're noticing in their neighborhood or in their city or in their region. What do you see as ways that we can all be making a difference in this transition? and achieving equitable outcomes, but also achieving our state goals.
That's a great question. I'll just give a really quick, simple answer. I think we should talk to each other, right? Like I think we need. There's a lot of room for increased communication and knowledge exchange and all that to make sure that some of these knowledge barriers to adoption are able to be bridged, right? So before I joined this job a few years ago, I had done an EV road trip around the Midwest to understand if I could do it. Like, is it fundamentally possible to make like a 1,600-mile road trip in a full electric vehicle in a region that maybe doesn't seem as obvious that you can successfully do it, right? We made it, we barely made it. There were a number of times when we got to charging stations where like there were 4 or 5 different charging stalls and only one worked. And if that last one wasn't working, we would have been stranded, right, overnight. So that was one piece. But I think going out there, one thing that was really interesting was that we had so many people come up to us while we were parked and charging just to ask, like, what is this? What are you doing? What's happening here? Why are you doing this? And people were like really genuinely curious and open-minded, and it was really delightful to talk to folks about all of this. So I think we should just talk to each other more.
Yeah, to echo that, I think, especially during the plan, people were really excited and wanted to learn more about it. I think just like from a local level, like wherever you live, or it's San Francisco, Oakland, or anywhere else in the Bay Area, just tell your city councilor. I think, and especially I hear a lot of things that people don't like, especially if it has to do with parking. But if there is a project going on or a program around EVs or bringing EVs to other communities, just say like, just a quick email. You don't have to even like show up to every meeting. A quick email saying to your city councilor, I support this. I think just to build up to the thing, because usually people only say when they don't like something. And so the things that people actually like, if you liked it enough that you actually wanted to tell us, oh wow, maybe I should focus on this. That's just kind of something really easy and simple. And I think people saying you did a great job or that you really liked something really stands out when you have a kind of a long list of people being angry and mad at you. so like that's just it. Just to say that like that doesn't matter a little bit.
I think the biggest thing is that people get comfortable with new technology when they see their neighbors and people they trust using it. And I bought a Chevy Volt the first year it came out, and it was sitting there in my driveway with a charger, right? And people would walk by and see it, and they'd ask me about it. And I feel like that really made lots of other people think, oh, so, and I would just tell them, well, it's just like another car, right? Except I don't have to stop at the gas station. But it just feels like a regular car. And I think, then people in my neighborhood got used to this, not just because of me, but now, in our neighborhood, there's a ridiculous number of Teslas driving around. And so it would just be totally normal. People would be comfortable, oh, everybody else is doing that, I should do that too. I think that that's one of the best ways to kind of spread that comfort with EVs, that if you can ask a neighbor or somebody else you know what their experience has been, and they had a fine experience, that it's good. And I think this actually hurts us in another sector when we're trying to do building decarbonization, right? And we're trying to get people to adopt heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and electric stoves and all that. You have no idea if your neighbor's doing that. You would have no way of knowing, like, this is a thing, it works. And so we don't get the same kind of viral spread and viral comfort by the fact that you see it sitting in someone's driveway and, oh, okay, this is just the thing my neighbors are doing. But we have that advantage with EVs, and I think that's one of the best things to do. And that's why it's actually really important to get some of these cars into neighborhoods where there aren't very many of them yet, because that's going to then help spread it in those places as those early adopters in every neighborhood can say, yeah, it's a great car.
Great. Well, thank you all. Clearly, we could have spent a lot more time on this topic, and hopefully people will continue. I want to say a huge thank you to Matt for partnering with us on this event. Really nice to be engaged with new partners as we're doing this work, so thank you. And Scott, thank you to you and Wilson Cincini, who's been a tremendous partner to CLE, and thank you for you. And a huge thank you to our panelists for sharing your time with us and your expertise.
Cookies away.
Oh yeah,